Oh, she could, yes.
Okay. I'll call the meeting to order. We're going to start, although we are expecting more people to arrive. Some of our members are doing a presentation. Council Executive tonight.
Yeah. It's Council Exec,
Yeah.
it's the comedy night for Kensal Rise
Yeah.
Library, so a lot of people are going to that.
Yeah, we're facing big competition this evening. I've got at least, I think, 3 competing events.
Yes.
Hence our numbers are a bit dwindled, I'm afraid. The biggest of these events, I think, is the campaign meeting over the closure of the libraries, and particularly focusing on Kensal Green Library. And a couple of us, at least, after this meeting, are going to go herring off to do the night shift from midnight till 5 o'clock on the vigil at Kensal Green Library. Anybody who's not working or is an insomniac is welcome to join us. It may well be that some other people will be coming in a bit later because they're coming back from the Council Executive to do a presentation. But let that not perturb us. Thank you for coming. This meeting has been organised by Brent Campaign Against Climate Change. I'm the Secretary of Brent Campaign Against Climate Change. We're a broad network involving lots of different bodies, trade unions, residents groups, climate campaigners. As part of what we do, we've been running this series of meetings, the third one. We've been calling it, it's a bit of a misnomer actually, environmental writers meetings. The purpose really is to sort of develop to invite different takes on the issue of climate change and how we should respond to it. We have our big public meetings. We've got a big public meeting coming up on November on food, floods and climate change, and that's going to be in Wembley. And if you're on our mailing list, you'll get notice of the details imminently. But these are the smaller meetings when we can look at things a little bit differently. Part of our purpose is to raise public awareness. And I think as part of developing awareness of the threat of climate change, it is important that creative writers start to take the subject as an appropriate subject for literature. And that's one of the reasons we've invited China along this evening. Now, if you've seen the publicity, you'll know that China is one of the most innovative writers in Britain today. I was going to say young writers, it's a bit patronising, isn't it?
No, please, I wish. I'm 39. Any scraps of youth I'll grab.
No, very young, by the way.
Very young.
Yeah,
Very young.
Has also written a novel for young adults, Unlondon. He's a fantasy fiction writer. He also writes on international law, I believe. So the question is, what's stopping creative writers getting into the question of climate change much more directly? So it's really over to China. When are we going to get the great climate change novel?
Well, some people would say that it's already been written. I mean, I would disagree with them, but there are various candidates out there. When we were talking about this meeting, and we were discussing various formats, and I was saying that I'm very keen to make it as much of a conversation as possible. And you were also saying that you thought people might be interested in a short reading, with immense hopes that it's not asking too much of an indulgence from you, I was going to read for about 6 or 7 minutes from a short story, which isn't wholly an indulgence, I promise. It is actually partly relevant to the point I want to make, which is about the way writers can talk about climate change and so on. There's basically, and more broadly, issues of ecology and ecological degradation and so on. And there's two, in the stuff I've written, there's 2 kind of candidates for things that more directly deal with those issues. And one is the children's book Unlondon, which the baddie of which is a giant sentient cloud of pollution that wants to burn everything so that it can breathe the smoke into itself. It's not a sophisticated political allegory, but you know it does a certain job. And the other is this short story that I wrote a few months ago, and I wanted to read about 6 or 7 minutes from that short story, which obliquely touches these issues, and then talk for a couple of minutes about that, and then maybe we could sort of open it up for a discussion and so on. So this is just a short section from the middle of a short story called Cove Hythe, which, by the way, is a real place on the East Anglian coast and the single most extraordinary stretch of coastline in Britain, and I thoroughly recommend people go there. So this is called Cove Hythe, and it's just a little bit from the middle. There's a guy and his daughter are watching the sea at midnight. He could make out nothing beyond the headlight gaze and hear nothing but waves. He recce once more, but they were not observed. This cliff top was out of bounds, and they, intruders, were alone. His daughter kept watching the water. Duggan wondered if she would complain or ask how long or anything, but she did not. 20 minutes later, it was she who pointed, who first saw something in the sea. There were no helicopters now, nothing so noisy, no downcast beams to light up what was coming, breaking water, way off the coast. It was only moonlit, a tower, a steeple of girders, streaming and rising. The girl stood. The metal was twisted, off true and angular like a skew-whiff crane resisting collapse. It did not come steadily, but lurched, hauling up and landward in huge jerks. After each, a swaying hesitation, then another move higher and closer. The lights on the beach went out. Flame ignited at the tower's tip. Sooty sepia guttering lit the shaft. The sea at its base spread flat and fell away suddenly from rising intricate blockness, black, angled and extrusioned, as if a quarried wedge of the seabed itself had come up to look. The tower work was on a platform. In the glow of the thing's own flame they saw edificial flanks, the concrete and rust of them, the iron of the pylon barnacled, shaggy with benthic growth, now lank, gelatinous bunting. It was coming at the Cove Hythe cliffs. Under its stains and excrescences were more regular markings, stencilled warnings, paint remnants, an encircled H. Another step, because these were clumsy steps with which it came, and all the main mass was out of the water and raining brine. It waded, each concrete cylinder leg a building or a smokestack wide. The two on one side came forward together, then those on the other. Pipes dangled from its roof-high underside. Clots of it fell back into the sea. It wore steel containers, ruins of housing like a bad neighbourhood, old hoists, lift shafts emptying of black water. A few waves' width from the beach, it hesitated. It licked the air with a house-sized flame. P-36, the man said. Petrobras. The platform was at the level of their cliff top. Now the girl understood its strange ungainliness. On each side, its supports merged at their base into two horizontal struts, so it moved like a quadruped skiing. What must have been 10 feet of water lapped at the struts like a puddle at a child's shoes. The rig facelessly faced north and slide-stamped along the shoreline. It was slowing. The smell was stronger, and the ground, the air, juddered, not only in time to its huge steps. Duggan and his daughter hugged the tree trunks and watched the oil rig sway in their direction. He held her hand. On an autumn evening in the early-ish years of the 21st century, a fishing boat southeast of Halifax radioed an SOS, under attack. The transmission was unclear. Rescuers found two traumatised survivors in a wash of scattered debris. As they did, the cause of the catastrophe reached the coast. Authorities could not suppress civilian footage of what had come back. It was the Rowan Gorilla 1. That was the first. No Piper Alpha, no Deepwater Horizon, an undistinguished disaster. A tripod jack-up rig lost to storms and hull fracture in 1988 on its way to the North Sea, scattered surely by its capsizing and by 30 years below, but there, back, cramped looking for all its enormity, latticed legs braced halfway through its platform, jutting above it and below into the sea. In the videos, the three skyward leg halves switch and lean creaking towards each other, sway again like cranes, triple knitting, as it walks the muck on spud-capped feet. It staggered like a crippled Martian out of the water and onto Canada. It shook the coast with its steps. It walked through buildings, swatted trunks, then tanks out of its way with ripped cables and pipes that flailed in inefficient, deadly motion like ill-trained snakes, like too heavy feeding tentacles. It reached with corroded chains, wrenched obstacles from the earth. It dripped seawater, chemicals of industrial ruin and long hoarded oil. 10 miles inland, a line of artillery blew the thing apart. Later, they made that area a memorial park. Sections of the rig's deck they left unsalvaged, preserved amid flower beds. By panics and mess-ups, Duggan's unit had been trapped on the far side of the wounded platform, between the Rowan Guerrilla 1, they later realised, and the sea. A third of his comrades had been killed, crushed, torn by wires, caught in its final explosion, bequeathing him years of dreams and memories of trodden men. The world was still reeling, investigation barely begun, when the Ocean Express, capsized in 1976 with 13 dead, which must have been quietly recomposing itself at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, stood upright in relatively shallow water and strode inland. Fighter jets scrambled from Eglin, inflicted severe damage, slowed it, and the USS Kearney torpedoed one of its supports. The rig buckled, tilted, and seemed to wait, kneeling like a bettered knight. The Kearney had shelled it apart. Duggan saw this from the Kearney's decks. He and several comrades had been flown in as advisors to the US Navy. He was combatant himself again soon enough, at the return of the Key Biscayne off Australia and the fire-mottled Seaquest's attempt to walk into Nigeria. National governments subcontracted strategy to the UN Platform Event Repulsion Unit. Scientists, engineers, theologians and exorcists, soldiers, veterans like Duggan of those first encounters. He learnt the new motions, the vastly swaying skittishness and violence of the revenant rigs. His UN colleagues strove to decode this hydrocarbon Ragnarok. Twice, Duggan boarded pitching, stinking decks to transmit to them close-up footage from which they learnt nothing. They tried to figure out what economies of sacrifice were being invoked, for what this was punishment. Ruined, lost, burnt, scuffled rigs were healing on the ocean floor and coming back. Platform, jack-up, semi-submersible, all the lost. So that's a little section from Cove Hive. And I was reading it for two reasons. Partly sheer ego, because I was asked to read something. That's my excuse. I wasn't I? Back me up here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And second of all, because to me, it's there is, I think, an issue about the way political issues and political questions are sort of mediated through fiction. And as you can tell from that passage, and as you can tell if you read the kids' book that I wrote, I would be very embarrassed if anyone thought they were kind of, rigorous and systematic critiques of the political economy of climate change, or sort of scientific explorations of the nature of the disaster that possibly awaits us if we don't stop the way things are going. But I don't think that I mean obviously I would say this, I'm invested in saying this, but I don't think that makes them illegitimate aesthetic responses to climate change. In some ways, I think the premise of the meeting is problematic. It's questionable in the sense that actually I think a fairly large number of, well, I shouldn't say large, but a growing number of writers are quite explicitly dealing with climate change. And the most obvious and most high profile is obviously Ian McEwan, at least in this country, with solar. You don't think?
I don't think it addresses the issue. It
Oh,
uses it as a pretext.
Well, but you see, that's a separate issue. You see, I think this raises it's a book that couldn't have been written without the questions of climate change being very much on the agenda. This is not I'm not making a claim about the quality either of the book as fiction or as political intervention, but I'm saying I think there are an increasing number of books which are predicated on the fact of climate change and the fact of the discourse of climate change. In fact, what you're suggesting, I think, really gets at the problem. I think, if anything, part of the problem for a writer who wants to, in fact for any of us, but for a writer or an artist or a musician or whatever who wants to kind of engage with this stuff through a kind of filter of aesthetics, I think I would suggest that part of the problem is not so much that no one is talking about it. It is that a certain section of people are talking about it in such a way that it's actually quite easy to bleed of any really sharp political intervention, I think it's very easy actually to have a fairly anodyne political approach to climate change, and that lends itself quite well to a certain type of literature, which I think is not particularly my favourite fiction or whatever. And I think this is the same kind of problem that faces the kind of political interventions over climate change in this country. This is obviously slightly different in the States, where there's a much sharper right-left divide over the issue of climate change. But in this country, I think part of the problem is that for an awful lot of people, including people for whom those of us on the left would not really have much sort of agreement about strategies for the way forward, the fact of climate change in a very nebulous, generalised way is kind of a given, I mean, obviously we're not talking here about giant industrialists, but every other Tory you meet is going to sort of say, oh yes, it's a terrible thing, we need to work out, So actually that seems to me to be the critical question here. As a writer of fiction, I think it's very important, and I would say this for any kind of creative industries, anyone doing art or music or film or whatever. I think that not only that your job is not to, when you write like that, to kind of present a systematic political or scientific exposition of the problem. I think in a way it's really problematic if you do. I think that's not the role of these things. So one of the things I'm very interested in talking about here is the way, inevitably, as this becomes a huge issue, as it is and should, as it is becoming and absolutely should become a huge issue facing all of us, I think it's going to crop up more and more and more, and I think we can already see it in an awful lot of cultural products. The question is whether or not writers and others have a quote, duty to approach it in a certain way, or whether whether kind of filtering it through into a much more kind of fantasticated field, whether that's a political abdication, which is what some people might sternly say, or whether it's a perfectly legitimate aesthetic response. And as you can imagine, I would take the latter line, but I would only take the latter line allying that to the claim that when we talk about it on a political level, it's absolutely incumbent on us to take an extremely hard and serious and politically rigorous position. So I don't think these are contradictions, but I think you have to have both. And this is why writers that sort of talk about, my fiction is my activism, I have very little time for, because it seems to be a way of kind of essentially avoiding a sharper interjection. And this is just to conclude. This is not a new position. This is a position that a lot of kind of politically active and left writers and artists have taken over many years. So, for me, one of the touchstone texts here is a text by the surrealist Benjamin Perret, who was one of the great leftists of the surrealist movement, and he wrote a review of a collection of political poetry, and kind of much to everyone's surprise, it was an extremely critical review. And his review, and he was like by far the most left-wing, activist in the surrealists, and also a poet and a writer and so on. And he reviewed I think the review was actually called "The Dishonour of Poets," and his review basically said, the big problem with this is that it's bad poetry because it is, because it's so concerned to sort of say the right thing politically that it's just kind of, it's collapsing as poetry. And he absolutely had the kind of political chops to say this. And this was not an argument for the kind of abdication of political engagement in art, but it was just a way of sort of saying that, if what you're writing is a political poem in this case, you have to have fidelity to the poem half of that phrase as well. You have to have fidelity to the, so if I sit down and I want to write, like, when I wrote Cove Hyde or I wrote London, I was perfectly aware that issues around climate change and the environment, and indeed in both cases, particularly with London, trying to bring a certain kind of playful but nonetheless serious discussion about not just the fact of the environment, but the political economy behind it, the politics behind it. The fact that climate change doesn't just happen, it is done by some people to other people, trying to bring that in. But always being aware also that if it didn't keep a 10-year-old interested, it was failing as a book. And if the 10-year-old didn't walk away having a kind of hard left critique of climate change, that didn't really, that didn't mean that I was a terrible writer. If they went away saying that was a great story, then that's great. And then we talk about these other things in other arenas. So I think that you're trying to kind of reflect and refract more than reflect these things that are in the air, but that I would always caution against a certain kind of political moralism when it comes to the reflection, the exposition of these issues, I think. So that's what I would say as a kind